Hi, I'm Juliet Parker, the Director of ALNAP, the Learning Network for the Humanitarian Sector, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the launch of ALNAP's new guide for adapting the OECD criteria for the evaluation of humanitarian action. The humanitarian system is facing a period of significant uncertainty. Reductions in funding from traditional donors, alongside the increasing scale, complexity, and duration of crises, are putting real pressure on how we work and the choices we make. At the same time, the sector is grappling with long-standing challenges around power, equity, and sustainability. In this context, evaluation isn't optional, it's essential. It helps us understand what's working, what isn't, and what needs to change. During today's session, you'll have the opportunity to familiarize yourself with how the guide is structured and the changes that have been made in this edition, as well as to hear examples of its practical application. Developing this guide has been a significant piece of work, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge the many people who've contributed to it, including those involved in the advisory group, the reference group, and who engaged in the many consultation opportunities. In particular, I'd like to thank the writing team, Sarah Garby, Margie Buchanan-Smith, and Pamela Combonido Alpha, who you will hear from shortly, and Susanna Morrison-Metois, who led the early stages of the project for us. And with that, I'm delighted to hand you over to Julia Steets, Director of GPPI, who will be hosting today's event.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the official launch of ALNAP's updated guide on evaluation criteria, adopting the OECD criteria for the evaluation of humanitarian action. We are delighted to have you with us today. My name is Julia Steets. I am Director of the Global Public Policy Institute, GPPI, and I've been a member of the advisory group for the development of this guide. I'll be your host for the next hour, and I must say I'm delighted that we're getting this new guide. So much is changing in the humanitarian sector, and I think it's essential for us to have the evidence on what works and what doesn't, and to use that evidence to steer what people have started to call the humanitarian reset. Before we start, could you please put your names and positions in the chat so that we get to know each other at least a little bit? If you have questions to the ALNAP team, please put those in the chat as well. The authors will answer as many of these questions as they can during this event. We're also posting right now links to the full guide in English and French, and to a brief with the definitions of key concepts in English, French, Arabic, and Spanish. Now let's start with some background to the humanitarian evaluation criteria and to the work ALNAP has been doing on them. We will first hear from Alistair Hallam from Valid Evaluations. He will take us right back to the 1990s and the origins of the humanitarian evaluation criteria in the Rwanda genocide evaluation. We will then hear from Susanna Morrison-Metois. She's a senior research fellow at ALNAP. And Susanna led ALNAP's work to update the guidance from 2020 to 2023. This involved forming the advisory group, making the background research and global survey, and launching the global consultation process. Susanna will give us some insights into the initial stages and thinking on ALNAP's new guide.
I was part of the core team for the joint evaluation of emergency assistance following the genocide in 1994. The evaluation took place in 1995 and was one of the first major evaluations of humanitarian assistance. And the evaluation led to initiatives such as Sphere, People in Aid, the Humanitarian Ombudsman, as well as developing new criteria for the evaluation of humanitarian assistance. There were existing DAC criteria, but they'd been designed for development programs, and it was felt it would be useful to have a look at the criteria and see whether they needed refining for the humanitarian sphere. The response to the 1994 genocide was a fertile time for the development of humanitarian assistance policies and for new innovations in the field. There was a lot of soul-searching at the time about the response to the genocide, as it was felt to be very suboptimal in many ways. Many people were involved in discussing how to improve things. Danida took a leadership role. and brought together many humanitarian actors and helped organize this system-wide evaluation of the response. Probably the very first system-wide humanitarian evaluation. And there were many meetings around that time involving donors, NGOs, Red Cross partners, the UN, academics, and amongst other things, these discussions led to a close analysis of the existing OECD DAC criteria, which were efficiency, effectiveness, impact, sustainability, and relevance. And it was felt they could do a reasonable job, but that they could be improved. So to take one example, humanitarian assistance interventions, in contrast to development projects, are not usually designed to be sustainable. So why have this criteria? However, they still need assessing in regard to whether, as they respond to acute and immediate needs, they take the longer term into account. Drawing on some work by Larry Meniere in a paper that he wrote in 1994, we proposed introducing connectedness as an alternative. And this refers to the need to assure that activities of a short-term emergency nature are carried out in a context which takes longer-term and interconnected problems into account. There were other changes we also thought were necessary. We thought we should include the criteria of coverage, which is the need to reach major population groups facing life-threatening suffering wherever they are, providing them with assistance and protection proportionate to their need and devoid of extraneous political agendas. This also came from the Meniere paper. Coverage alerts evaluators that complex emergencies and associated humanitarian programs can have very different impacts on different population subgroups, whether these are defined in terms of ethnicity or gender, socioeconomic status, occupation, location, or family circumstance. Another addition to the OECD DAC criteria which we proposed was coherence, and this referred to the need for policy coherence. For example, there have been instances of one major UN agency promoting the return of refugees to their host country, while another is diametrically opposed to such policies. And as mentioned, these three additional criteria, connectedness, coverage, and coherence, came from a Larry Meniere paper from 1994. The addition of the new, what we called sub-criteria, generated considerable controversy. Some argue that there was no need to alter the DAC criteria, as they could be interpreted to incorporate the sub-criteria. Others found that the sub-criteria helped them to focus on issues of particular relevance to humanitarian assistance programs. So rather than be prescriptive and come down one way or the other, we introduced the sub-criteria into the discussions and suggested evaluators use whatever they felt were most appropriate. I think there'll always be debate about such things. Some people like one approach, some people like a different approach, some people like things to be made explicit, some implicit. And I think it's healthy to have that debate.
Our original ALNAP guide was published in 2006, and it surprisingly stood the test of time very well. So even almost 20 years later, it remained one of the most downloaded ALNAP publications. So despite the fact that it was continued to be well used, the language was becoming more and more dated, and obviously there had been major changes in the humanitarian sector. At the same time, the OECD DAC also updated the definitions of the criteria. So given this, we knew that even though ALNAP's original guide continued to be used, it definitely needed at least a facelift. So a lot of ALNAP's work really seeks to engage our membership, to engage our users, and we wanted the guide to be useful for the wider sector. And so the first step was really looking at what were the key issues. So trying to better understand the challenges that people were having. So not just with the criteria in theory, but what were the real practical challenges when you try to take these criteria and apply them in really complex humanitarian settings. There was this kind of debate then of, should we aim to make radical changes? Should we try to push the envelope? Should we say that we really want to change the humanitarian sector, so we need criteria that are going to be transformative, that are going to drive that change? Or there was a question of saying, actually, the original guide is so well used that maybe what it just needs is a bit of a tweak, a bit of a refresh. What we focused on then was designing a process in which we could gather feedback and gather views to help us make those decisions. And so not just base revisions on consultation with just a handful of key experts. And at the end of the day, our aim is really to try to make sure that we can help improve the quality of humanitarian evaluations, because ultimately evaluations are one of the key tools to make sure that we're holding the sector to account, that we can see progress, that different humanitarian actors are meeting their commitments and their responsibilities. And ultimately, the goal is to better serve affected populations and understand through evaluations if we're missing the mark.
Thank you so much, Alistair and Susanna, for those insights. It's very good to have a reminder why the standard evaluation criteria need to be adapted for humanitarian assistance in the first place, why the ALNAP guide needed a facelift, as Susanna put it, and how ALNAP went about this process. Let's now turn to the new guide itself and see what it is there for, what it covers, and how you can use it.
Humanitarian crises are becoming more frequent, more complex, and more interconnected. In this context, evaluation isn't optional, it's essential. It helps us understand what's working, what isn't, and what needs to change. That's why ALNAP has developed a new guide, adapting the OECD criteria for the evaluation of a humanitarian action. This guide is complementary to the OECD guidance and an update of ALNAP's 2006 publication, which for nearly 2 decades has helped shape how evaluation is done in humanitarian settings. Since 2006, the humanitarian landscape has changed dramatically. Crisis contexts are more protracted, power imbalances are under greater scrutiny, and evaluators are being asked tougher questions about learning, accountability, and whose voices are being heard. This new guide responds to those challenges. It's based on a wide-ranging participatory process that involved hundreds of evaluation professionals and stakeholders across languages, regions, and organizations. So what does the guide do? At its core, it helps you adapt the OECD evaluation criteria in a way that is relevant, useful, and realistic for humanitarian action. It covers 7 key criteria: relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, coherence, coverage and inclusion, and interconnection. Each criterion has been updated, redefined, and in one case renamed to reflect current humanitarian realities and challenges. You will find new guidance on when and how to apply each one, and how to avoid using them rigidly and generically, because not every criterion applies to every evaluation. Instead, the guide encourages flexible, purposeful use, grounded in what evaluation users need to know. As the guide puts it, fit the evaluation questions to the criteria, not the other way around. The guide also draws attention to the power dynamics and positionality that influence evaluations and how criteria are interpreted. Whose knowledge counts? Who decides what gets evaluated and how? And who defines success? And so, under each criteria, the guide introduces shifting the lens, power, and positionality. These prompts encourage evaluators to reflect on what is evaluated, how and by whom, inviting shifts that enhance the fairness, accuracy, and relevance of evaluation process and findings. The guide also recognizes that evaluation can do more than improve performance. It can help drive real transformational change in the sector. To support that, it introduces 3 priority themes. These came directly from what people told us during the consultation process. Issues that kept coming up where the humanitarian system needs to do better, and where evaluation can really make a difference. 1. Putting people affected by crisis at the center. 2. Locally led humanitarian action. 3. The environment and climate crisis. These themes can be evaluated on their own or integrated into the criteria. So how do you use the guide? It's designed to be flexible. You can read it start to finish to build foundational knowledge or dip into it as a reference when designing or managing an evaluation. Each chapter includes a definition, key messages, methodology notes, links to humanitarian principles, examples of evaluation, and reflections on power and positionality. The guide emphasizes intentional, informed selection based on context and purpose. And while affected people may not always be users of evaluations, they are always key stakeholders. This guide promotes thoughtful inclusion of their perspectives throughout the process. So who is this guide for? It's for evaluators, commissioners, practitioners, students, and anyone seeking to strengthen humanitarian evaluation. Whether you are brand new to evaluation or have decades of experience, this guide gives you clarity on using the criteria in humanitarian settings and food for thoughts on a range of key issues relating to the evaluation of a humanitarian action. It uses accessible language, supports learning and accountability, and adapts to real-world constraints. Our guide, Adapting the OECD Criteria for the Evaluation of a Humanitarian Action, is available now at alnap.org. Use it, share it, and let it support better evaluation and stronger, more accountable humanitarian action.
Thanks a lot to the ALNAP team for producing this overview. We're now privileged to have the three authors of the guide with us. They are Margie Buchanan-Smith, Pamela Combinido-Elfa, and Sarah Garby. I'll hand over to Alejandro Posada, who's a research fellow at ALNAP, so he can explore with the authors what came out of the consultation process, what their thoughts are about some of the content of the guide, and what they hope the guide will achieve. Over to you, Alejandro.
Thank you very much for that, Julia. We are excited to now be jumping to the next section of the conversation, which is a conversation with all the authors of the guidance. My name is Alejandro Posada. I'm a research fellow at ALNAP, and I'm going to be moderating this conversation. For this part of the event, we're going to have Margie Buchanan-Smith, who is an independent evaluator and policy researcher and one of the co-authors of the paper. Pam Combinido-Elfa, the leader of the Humanitarian Advisory Group, and Sarah Garby, research fellow at ALNAP. So to start us off, I wanted to ask, why do you feel this guide is important, and why do you think there's a need for specific guidance on criteria for evaluating of humanitarian action? Maybe we can start with Margie.
Yeah, thanks, Alejandro. Well, I think let's start with the importance of evaluating humanitarian action, which is really key to knowing if we're making a positive difference as humanitarians, when we're providing assistance and support to those most in need, and indeed if there are any negative consequences of what we're doing and how we're doing it that we need to be aware of. For example, are we inadvertently fueling grievances? Are we adequately taking conflict dynamics into account? So good and professional evaluation is more important than ever, especially when resources for humanitarian action become more limited, to make sure that they're really being used and allocated in the best possible way. So when we're evaluating humanitarian action, there are some really fundamental attributes that we're looking for. So, for example, is it relevant to the context? Is it reaching those most in need? Those are two of the key criteria, relevance and coverage. Is it achieving the desired results and avoiding some of those harmful consequences that I mentioned? That's the criterion of effectiveness. So those are just some examples. But what the criteria do is they provide a normative framework for assessing the benefits, the merits of humanitarian action. And there's a lot of value in this being a common normative framework so that we can learn across evaluations and across humanitarian programming. There's also more than 3 decades now of humanitarian evaluation experience to draw upon, and we've really tried to capture what some of the key learning is from that evaluation experience, to capture that in the guide, to make sure that we're constantly progressing and moving forward. So that's just a little bit about how the criteria have evolved and how they've been updated.
Thank you, Margie. Sarah, do you want to also complement that question?
Yes, obviously I agree with everything that Margie said, but I can add that this guide that we're launching today is an updated and revised version of a guide that we published in 2006. And still to this day, it remains one of our most downloaded resources. This shows that there is a clear need for guidance on how to apply the OECD evaluation criteria and the evaluation of humanitarian action. But obviously, 2006 is a long time ago. It's almost 20 years ago. And the 2006 guide is outdated in many ways. A lot of changes have occurred since then, not only in humanitarian action, but also in evaluation practice. Obviously, also the OECD have updated their definitions. They did that in 2019. So there was a real need for us to update and to provide fresh guidance on how to apply these criteria and in the evaluation of humanitarian action.
Thank you, Sada. And Pam, do you also want to add something here?
Yes, thanks, Alejandro. Maybe one thing I'd add is that, especially for emerging evaluators or those working in unfamiliar contexts, we hope this guide can act as a professional compass. It's not only encouraging rigor, but also reduces ambiguity around what should be evaluated and how, and giving them more confidence and clarity in their work. And this is specifically important because we're working in a sector where lives are at stake, and you often hear humanitarian actors saying that decisions must be done swiftly. So, clear evaluation criteria are not just helpful, they're essential to turning good intentions into real lasting impact.
Great. Well, thank you all for those introductions. I'm also a bit interested in learning more about the multi-year process that has led to the publication of this guide. So, Sada, could you maybe tell us a little bit about how that went?
Yes, of course. So we've been working on this guide at ALNAP for several years. And right from the start, we decided that we wanted the guide or the revised guides to be based on a participatory and evidence-informed process. It was really important for us at ALNAP that it was not written in isolation from the humanitarian evaluation community. And the process was supported right from the start by an advisory group. They represent different parts of ALNAP constituency. And that means that they were able to bring different perspectives and support the process with different experiences and perspectives. They were able to provide us with very valuable advice all along the process, and in a way were instrumental in providing a reality check to the work that we were doing at ALNAP. A couple of years ago, we also commissioned and published a review paper, and that paper outlines how the OECD criteria are used in humanitarian evaluation and also takes a look at alternative frameworks. The paper is still available on our website for those interested in looking at or reading more about the different opportunities and challenges with the use of the OECD criteria in the evaluation of humanitarian action. Once we've published a paper, we also organized a large number of consultation events. Over 500 people participated in those events, and they were both face-to-face and online in many different countries and in several different languages. They were organized with UN agencies, but also different evaluation associations and consultancy firms, etc. And the last part of that kind of data gathering that we wanted to do was an online survey where we gathered input from over 300 people. And all of these activities in the consultation phase was for us to make sure that we understood how the criteria are used in the evaluation of humanitarian action and what needs users have from the guide. Our ambition is really for the guide to be as useful to as many people as possible. I would say that briefly summarizes all the work that we've been doing before we started writing the actual guide.
Thank you, Sada. And Margie, do you want to also come in on that multi-year process and how it went?
Yes, I just wanted to add how I think, quite remarkable was how inclusive the consultation process has been, which is really to ALNAP's credit. So the consultation happened across continents, across countries. So I know that in-person events were held, for example, in Thailand and Spain, just to give a couple of examples. But online events were also held in 3 different languages, in French, Arabic, and English. So that's been really important to ensure that a wide and diverse range of views fed into the updating of the guide, also a wide range of experience of humanitarian action. And I think we really benefited from that in writing the guide. So we've tried to make sure that we've taken that diverse range of views and experience into account, so that the guide will be useful to a multicultural audience. It will appeal to a diverse audience. So that's something we've been very mindful in the writing of the guide.
So that's really interesting about the inclusive and participatory approach that you were describing for the guide. I'm just wondering if there were any surprises that came out of that process that struck you. Sara, was there anything?
Yes, thank you, Alejandro. I think that when we embarked on this journey on the before the consultation phase, we really didn't know. One of the key questions we had was, will the evaluation committee want us to align with the OECD criteria, or will they want us to develop an alternative framework? We were very open to any feedback that we would receive, and so I would say I was a bit surprised over how overwhelmingly positive um, the feedback was that we should be aligning to the OECD criteria. Indeed, most event participants and survey respondents really thought that was the way ALNAP should go. Um, Slightly surprised because these criteria have been criticized or heavily criticized in the last few years for different reasons, but they do seem to be the preferred framework for, at least for the stakeholders that we engaged with. And my personal opinion or theory is that they are the preferred framework because they are so well known and so well established. They are used in a lot of contexts, in a lot of countries, and they are not only used in the humanitarian system, but also for development assistance and in peace building work. So they are criteria that enable a common language across context, countries, but also across the nexus, the humanitarian development, peace building nexus. The consultation data did also show that there was a need, a strong need, a strong request, and that kind of echoes what I was saying before, for guidance on how to apply the OECD criteria in humanitarian action. And when we started digging into the data, we did discover that there was a lot of differences and nuanced opinions on the usability of each individual criteria. This was super interesting, but sometimes made our work quite challenging because we had to make, and at times quite difficult decisions had to be made.
Thank you for that. Margie, is there anything that surprised you and that you also want to mention?
Yeah, thanks. I think there was a couple of points of feedback just to add to what Sarah and Pam have said, that did surprise me. So first of all, a lot of respondents felt that flexibility in the use of the criteria was as important as standardization. So that was a really interesting point of feedback that we've tried to take that on board in how the guide is written. The other point that surprised me was that the criterion of coverage hasn't been used more in evaluations in recent years. Certainly in evaluations I've done, I've used that criterion a lot and found it very helpful. So it was interesting to discover that actually it had been used relatively little, but at the same time, respondents were saying they wanted us to keep it, but the criterion of coverage is important, but it really should be expanded and should pay a lot more attention to issues of inclusion, equity. So that we've also really taken on board in the updated guide.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So you've told us a bit about how the guide promotes a flexible approach to using the criteria and to using the evaluation criteria. It'd be great to hear more about that flexibility and what you actually mean by that. Um, Margie, could you tell us a bit about that flexibility?
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing to say is that it's a guide. It's not a directive for how to use evaluation criteria. So we really want users of the guide to be discerning, to be thoughtful in how they use the evaluation criteria. So, for instance, um, whether you're a humanitarian program manager or an evaluation manager, when you decide to do an evaluation, the first two questions to ask are, first of all, who are the intended users of the evaluation? And secondly, and really importantly, what is it that those users want and need to know that would make a difference? So, using those two questions, then you can identify your evaluation questions, and that's the place to start. So, it's only when you've got your high level evaluation questions, then you would explore how they relate to the criteria. So, at that point, you might then dive into the guide and use the chapter on impact or the chapter on relevance, for example, um, to refine the evaluation and your thinking perhaps about the methodological implications. But what we advise against is using all the criteria as some kind of shopping list or checklist that have to be covered and have to be included in every evaluation. That's not how we'd like the guide to be used, because that does just end up with a shopping list that doesn't necessarily relate to the the issues to be explored in the evaluation. So, yeah, we'd really encourage users to be discerning and be selective in the criteria that they do use to make sure that they really relate to the topic of the evaluation and to the issues that you want to explore.
And my understanding is that you have chosen to include additional criteria. Partly, as you mentioned, this came out of the consultation. And these are additional criteria which are not part of the current OECD set. So which ones are they, and why have you decided to include them?
Yeah, so there are two that are not part of the current OECD set. Both actually appear in the old guide, but we have updated them in this new guide. So the first one is indeed coverage and inclusion, and that's about who humanitarian action is reaching, and especially how it relates to need, including protection needs. So this is a really critical criterion for evaluating humanitarian action to assess whether humanitarian action is indeed needs based and therefore is it impartial, which happens to be one of the four humanitarian principles that most organizations are working to. But in this guide, inclusion is now part of this criterion for the first time. So this is about evaluating whether humanitarian action is reaching people in need, those affected by the crisis, without discrimination, making sure that there's no discrimination, for instance, on the basis of ethnicity or gender or religious belief or sexual orientation, just to mention a few factors that can be related to discrimination. And the factors that drive discrimination are quite often amplified in a humanitarian crisis. So, discrimination against those living in remote geographical areas or people with disabilities or older people, that maybe those factors of discrimination may be present all of the time, but as I say, are amplified in a crisis. And the criterion of coverage and inclusion encourages evaluators to investigate whether the barriers faced by some of these marginalized groups have been removed in humanitarian action, and if their specific needs, for example, the specific needs of people living with disabilities or older people or women, whether those specific needs have been met. The second additional criterion is interconnection. Now, this was called connectedness in the old guide, and we've actually renamed it interconnection because we think that translates better into other languages and is a little bit clearer. And this criterion is about exploring whether humanitarian action, which is often short term, whether it takes account of the medium and longer term. So an example here would be where humanitarian actors are providing free veterinary services to livestock owners. Are they also thinking about what's are the consequences, what's the impact in the medium to longer term if the provision of those veterinary services is normally based on a cost recovery system? How is that transition going to happen back to that medium term cost recovery system? Um, Also, where humanitarian action is carried out alongside development and peace building, and that's very often the case, how are these different types of programming, these different types of intervention, how are they connected? So this relates to what's sometimes called the triple nexus. And is the relationship between humanitarian action and peace building, for example, is it appropriate to the context? So that this, under the criterion of interconnection, this is where this would be looked at. So the OECD criteria, they include the criterion of sustainability. And sometimes that may be useful when evaluating humanitarian action. For instance, if you've got a long-term refugee caseload and you're evaluating management of that caseload, if one objective has been building the capacity of the hosting government, then issues of sustainability may be appropriate. But if you're looking at humanitarian assistance to a population group that's displaced for a short period of time, then sustainability may not be the most appropriate criterion. If you're looking at the sustainability of the provision of services, that may not be appropriate if that group is displaced for a relatively short period of time. So that's where we would really encourage users of the guide to think carefully about how to use this criterion of interconnection.
That's really useful. Thank you. Thank you for explaining those new criteria to us, Margie. I also know that the guide this time around has also included priority themes. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about what these priority themes are and why you decided to include them.
Yes, that's right, Alejandro. The priority themes are a new addition and were not included in the 2006 guide, and we're introducing them in this updated guide. So, the way we define priority themes is they provide an additional lens to evaluate humanitarian action. They complement the OECD criteria in many ways. And to us, most importantly, these priority themes offer opportunities for evaluation to enhance performance, and also support transformational change at the system level. And there are three priority themes. Sarah will give an overview of the last one, but the first two are putting affected people by crisis at the center, and this is linked to efforts within the system to improve how humanitarian actors engage with people affected by crisis. And in this priority theme, what we want to highlight is that despite commitments, there are deep rooted power imbalances that limit whether humanitarian actors are genuinely led by people affected by crisis. So, in this priority theme, there's guidance to support evaluators so they can explore, for example, the extent to which humanitarian actors are being led by or responding to the preferences and the priorities of people affected by crisis in a timely manner. The evaluators can also explore the quality of engagement, and this includes cultural sensitivity and power and trust between humanitarian actors and communities. And most importantly, if the perspectives of people affected by crisis have been listened to and were acted upon. The second priority theme is locally led humanitarian action, and we provided guidance on how evaluators, commissioners, and program staff can explore the extent to which, for example, humanitarian action shifts power and resources to frontline responders, supports local actors, or how they reinforce locally led crisis response and recovery, but also understanding the variations in local actors' values, priorities, and power dynamics. For example, their role in inclusion and exclusion of certain groups in receiving humanitarian assistance. I'm gonna hand over to Sarah for the third priority theme.
Thank you so much, Pam. Yes, indeed, we do have a third priority theme in the guide, which is the environment and climate crisis. As I hope we can all agree on, the current climate crisis is already having consequences for humanitarian action. But we do also know that very few evaluations of humanitarian action include this theme. And by including this theme in the guide, we hope, or we really want to encourage both commissioners of evaluations and evaluators to examine this area to a high. We know that the climate crisis can significantly increase humanitarian needs. It will contribute to displacement, instability, and violence, for example, through climate-related events like drought and floods. In the guide, we provide support to evaluators and commissioners on how to integrate this theme not only as a standalone theme, but also integrate it into each criteria. Um, we propose that evaluations can explore the extent to which humanitarian action contributes to or mitigates climate crisis. But we also think that an important aspect of this is exploring how humanitarian actors have considered local and indigenous knowledge, practice, and solutions around the environment and climate crisis and how humanitarian action is implemented. We also think there's a link here to the principle of do no harm, and that it is important for evaluations to consider how environmental factors were included in how humanitarian action is planned and implemented, and whether it minimizes negative environmental impacts.
Thank you, Sarah. I know that the guide also provides what feels like a very timely conversation and guidance related to power and positionality in evaluation. Pam, could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Thanks, Alejandro. And as you said, it's a timely conversation. So there's a strong acknowledgement, especially in the last few years, how power and positionality shape evaluation and interpretations of criteria. And this is something that came up strongly in consultations as well. The shorter definition of positionality is it shapes how you perceive the world and carry out evaluations based on your social identities, experiences, and affiliations, whether you're an evaluator, commissioner, or a program staff. And positionality affects which questions you ask, whose knowledge you prioritize, and how you frame and use findings. And more importantly, as well, positionality can introduce often subtly bias, for example, by reinforcing dominant narratives or privileging certain voices over others. So in the guide we called it shifting the lens, power and positionality, because our hope is that by recognizing positionality and power, we invite you to shift your lens to uncover blind spots, challenge inherited assumptions, and engage more equitably with diverse forms of knowledge and evaluation.
And if I may add on here, and this has already been touched upon by Pam, the feedback that we did receive during the consultation phase, there was a very strong demand for guidance on those issues in evaluation and humanitarian evaluation. For example, over 80% of the respondents in the survey thought that should include guidance on decolonization in the guide. And we're hoping that we're able to meet some of this need in this present guide. But we also think that this is something that we will need to continue exploring at ALNAP, and that this conversation is very important moving forward, um, to continue having in the evaluation community.
Great, thank you. So we've had a very engaging conversation. We went over the guidance, how it was produced, the various components that it includes. And to finish us off, I wanted to ask, maybe let's start with Margie. What do you hope that users take away from the guide?
Yeah, thanks. I really hope that how we've defined and explained the criteria makes them as accessible and useful to people as possible, to a very diverse audience, whether they're experienced evaluators, less experienced evaluators, but always remembering that our ultimate objective is contributing to more effective evaluations. I also hope that users of the guide are encouraged to make the material their own. So we really want the guide to stimulate thought and reflection, um, but we don't necessarily want people to follow it absolutely to the letter, but rather to really help them think through. Okay, what is it that we're trying to get at in this evaluation? Which criteria are the most appropriate? And I'm also hoping that um, our inclusion of humanitarian principles is useful. So this is something new in this guide, is looking at how the criteria relate to this fundamental normative framework of humanitarian principles. Our experience in evaluating against humanitarian principles is still emerging, is it's relatively new. So by relating the criteria to the principles, yeah, we very much hope that that also makes a major contribution.
Pam, do you also want to come in with your, what do you hope people take away from the guide?
Yes, thanks, Alejandro. To me, I hope the guide provides a solid anchor that helps users navigate difficult decisions or even opportunities when managing evaluation process, and even making sure that the findings are useful for people affected by crisis, from the key question that we put forward for each criteria and the definition, as Margie mentioned, to the methodological implications we outline and the opportunities to shift the lens. Lastly, I also hope that the guide not only brings clarity, but also inspiration. Margie mentioned this, it's not just about following a checklist, it's really about encouraging evaluators and humanitarian actors as well to ask those taken for granted questions, or even challenge our own assumptions in our relationship with people affected by crisis, and reflecting on our own role in these complex humanitarian environments.
Thank you, Pam. And Sarah, do you want to also come in on this question?
Yes, and I think we had a very high ambition of this guy being useful to as many people as possible. So my answer is going to be that I hope that we have succeeded in this ambition, and that the guide is useful not only to seasoned and experienced evaluators, but also to young and emerging evaluators, people doing their first evaluation, or agency staff who are commissioning their first evaluations. We know that commissioning evaluations and especially undertaking humanitarian evaluations can be really challenging in times, and I hope this guide will alleviate some of that hard work. Uh, I'm also very happy that we are the sections of power and positionality, that section that we just discussed, and that we are including the project themes in the guide. And I hope that by including these more reflective pieces um, that tackle power interests, that we're also able to contribute to change in the sector. And if I may be a bit optimistic, that we can move the needle a little bit in terms of how these issues are addressed in humanitarian evaluations. Finally, we haven't mentioned this before, but the guide also includes a range of good practice examples. We've tried to include really diverse types of evaluations. So I hope these will serve as inspiration um, to kind of think a bit outside the box, or to change the way we do things. Uh, Humanitarian evaluation community.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for your insights on the guidance and the new guide, and for the time for putting it together. Very excited to see how it's used. And yeah, I'll pass it over to Julia.
Thanks so much for moderating this conversation, Alejandro. I've learned a lot from what Margie, Pam, and Sarah have said, starting from why we need good humanitarian evaluations to what those evaluations should cover. I think the guide will help us all deal with really important challenges we experience when doing evaluations. For example, how we can better understand our own positionality and make sure this doesn't unduly influence the evaluation results. Before we end today's sessions, let's hear from some of the people who have a lot of experience in using the evaluation criteria in practice. Cristina de Nicolas Izquierdo from YECA led the review of regional coordination mechanisms in response to mixed movements in the Latin America region. This is an example of an evaluation that highlighted the issue of coordination, which is treated as a dimension of coherence in the guide. After that, we'll turn to Tasneem Moji, a very experienced independent evaluator. She was deputy team leader for the evaluation of the coverage and quality of the UNICEF humanitarian response in complex humanitarian emergencies, which highlights the coverage criterion. Links to these evaluations and to other good practice examples are in the guide, and we're now posting the links in the chat, and you can also find longer versions of the interviews on the ALNAP website.
The main objective of this review was to look into the regional interagency coordination mechanisms that respond to mixed population movements in the Latin America and the Caribbean region. The review had a specific focus on three main major UN-led mechanisms. I think, in summary, this review was designed to produce very concrete, realistic, and feasible, if we can say, recommendations to improve the overall effectiveness and efficiency of the humanitarian response, avoid duplication, and strengthen the best practices in terms of coordination in such a situation like, I can say, major sort of population movements in the region. The review analyzed coordination by level, by leadership type, by function, by interconnection, and relationships with governments. And I'm going to explain a little bit what this means. So the coordination by level. So what we did was examining the mechanisms, the coordination mechanisms, at the regional, sub-regional, and national levels, recognizing that there were coordination challenges and solutions that differed on the different levels. We also analyze coordination by leadership type, meaning that we categorize the mechanisms based on who leads them or who led them at the time. Those led by the UN system, those of a political nature led by the states, and those led by civil society. So doing this categorization somehow of the different types of coordination allowed us to look at or analyze different governance models and their effectiveness. Another category that we identified was by function. So we went from just mapping the structures to analyzing the practical implementation of the coordination across key functions. So these functions, we included how mechanisms handle needs assessments, for example, strategic planning, advocacy, fundraising, information management, and monitoring and evaluation of the response. Another aspect of the coordination that we looked at was interconnection. So we assess the joint efficiency, the complementarity, and the interconnection between the different mechanisms. So we look at each mechanism separately, and then we looked at the interconnection, the existence of the interconnection, and the quality of this interconnection, or the absence of interconnection. And the final way that we analyzed coordination was by relationships with governments. So the review also analyzed the relationship between these regional coordinating mechanisms and the national and regional government bodies of the host countries, or the different coordinated mechanisms that few countries would have for a particular region, like South America. We always do what we can. Lessons learned in regards of the result of this review in particular. One of them, very important, is that coordination requires dedicated resources. So effective coordination cannot be just an unfunded mandate. Another, I think, very important lesson learned is that the local actors have to be supported. Very often we see that local organizations, as critical as they are for sustainable response, and we are seeing that even more so in the current phase of enormously decreasing funding for humanitarian operations in general, they are overstretched, local actors. So we really saw that in talking about coordination, it's important not to overload local organizations and small organizations.
So the main purpose of the evaluation was to identify practical ways in which UNICEF could improve the coverage and quality of its humanitarian response in complex humanitarian emergencies. This evaluation was an opportunity to conduct a robust analysis of its programming across a variety of country contexts to understand the extent to which UNICEF was succeeding in reaching affected populations with high-quality humanitarian assistance. I think the most important thing for us was that we designed an Excel tool to collect coverage data. So this listed 2 of UNICEF's core commitments for children and humanitarian action for each sector in which UNICEF works, like nutrition, WASH, child protection. Then we identified how the country office had adapted these commitments to the local context as indicators. Then for each of the commitments or indicators, we recorded the number of people in need of assistance, the number that were targeted by the cluster, the number that was targeted by UNICEF, and then the number reached. And then the table also recorded the percentage of funding received for each sector against the amount requested so that we could see the link between funding and coverage if there was any. And then the team actually used this tool to track the data over 3 years for each case study country. So we could also see how coverage changed over time. I think the biggest lesson from the evaluation was that it's difficult to collect accurate data to calculate coverage. And this started with the number of people in need. So it was relatively straightforward to get numbers per sector from reports like the Humanitarian Needs Overview. But it was not always clear how comprehensive these numbers were or how they were calculated. So this was, I think, perhaps for us, one of the biggest challenges because we have to understand the number of people in need to then understand properly the coverage of the assistance. Another data limitation was that the numbers of people reached didn't reflect how they were reached. So, for example, someone receiving a one-off hygiene kit is counted as a person reached in exactly the same way as someone who received nutrition treatment over several months. So there's also no indication of whether the people were reached with assistance that adhered to standards. So this is why the quantitative data on coverage needs to be complemented with qualitative data. And I think it's really helpful that the guidance highlights that the coverage and inclusion criterion relates closely to effectiveness. And at a time when funding is so scarce that we're talking about hyper-prioritization, we really need transparency on how humanitarian agencies decide how many people to target with assistance, both collectively and individually. I think it's important to say that even though the evaluation team did have to grapple with a number of data challenges, it's really important to evaluate coverage because without this, how can we know how many people we helped? And perhaps more importantly, how many did we fail to reach? The humanitarian community has never been able to provide assistance to everybody in need, but we never talk about what happens to those we can't assist. And I think this matters in the current environment for humanitarian assistance because we need to highlight how many people we are not able to reach, either because of funding shortfalls or for other reasons like lack of access. Then we can hold those who are responsible to account. And we also have the evidence we need to advocate for better coverage.
Thank you to everybody for joining us today and for contributing questions and comments. If there's anything you'd like to discuss further, please email the ALNAP team at evalcriteria@alnap.org. We'll put that address in the chat. And let me also reiterate that you can find the guide and longer versions of some of the interviews we've heard today on ALNAP's website. As I said in the beginning, I'm very excited to have this new evaluation guide. I'm sure it will help many of us conduct robust evaluations. I believe that the humanitarian sector is unique in the way that it always questions itself and always tries to do better. I very much hope that donors and humanitarian organizations will also use that evidence that we have collected over the years and will continue to collect to guide the rather drastic changes that are going on in the sector at the moment. Thank you again, and have a good day.